Today's episode is from the Mahabharata. It's a story about Draupadi in an epic showdown with the Kauravas, who try to utterly humiliate her, only to face a divine twist and bold promises of revenge. Namaskar and welcome to Stories from India. This is a podcast that will take you on a journey through the rich mythology, folklore, and history of the Indian subcontinent. I am Narad Muni, the celestial storyteller and the original Time Lord. With my ability to travel through space and time, I can bring you fascinating stories from the past, the present, and the future. From the epic tales of the Mahabharata and Ramayana to the folk tales of the Panchatantra, to stories of Akbar Birbal and Tenali Raman, I have a story for every occasion. The purpose of the stories is neither to pass judgment nor to indoctrinate. My goal is only to share these stories with people who may not have heard them before, and to make them more entertaining for those who have. In this episode, we are back to the main storyline of the Mahabharata. We have done dozens of episodes from this epic before. If you haven't binged on those, please do check out the links in the show notes and on the site sfipodcast.com. Regardless, I'll recap the story so far. The Mahabharata is one of two major epics from India. The other is the Ramayana, which we have also covered here on this show. The Mahabharata kicked off with Bhishma, who was the crown prince of Hastinapur. Bhishma gave up the throne so that his father could play the geriatric Romeo. The price that Bhishma paid was a promise that he would never sit on the throne and never have children, and always serve whoever did sit on that throne. A nuance of the phrasing meant that when the throne room maid once accidentally sat on the throne while cleaning it, Bhishma would have had to obey her. Luckily for the citizens of Hastinapur, the maid did not realize this. Anyway, she would have been too scared to command the mighty Bhishma. Bhishma did his best and stuck to his promise, even though tragedy after tragedy struck the family. Every king who ascended to the throne seemed to quickly slide off of it as well. After much confusion and turmoil, Dhritarashtra became the king. Despite being blind, he was the only possible candidate of his generation. And now, Dhritarashtra was getting old as well. So you might think that it's a good thing that he had over 100 children, each physically able to handle the responsibilities of ruling a mighty empire. But the situation was not so simple. Dhritarashtra's oldest son, Duryodhan, was younger than Yudhishthir, the eldest of 5 boys of the previous emperor, Pandu. And Yudhishthir was certainly considered a much more sensible candidate to succeed Dhritarashtra. This public opinion forced Dhritarashtra to name Yudhishthir his crown prince, much to Duryodhan's chagrin. Duryodhan responded by trying to barbecue his cousins. Unknown to Duryodhan and the almost 100 Kaurav brothers, the Pandavas escaped. Rather than confronting Duryodhan, they decided to go on a countryside jaunt, incognito. Along the way, Bhim, the second oldest Pandav, married a demoness and had a child with her. Arjun outdid Bhim. He found a bride not only for himself but for each of his brothers as well. Due to an unfortunate misunderstanding, there was really just one bride across the 5 brothers, It was a ridiculous mix-up, worthy of a modern-day sitcom. Dhritarashtra and all the other Kauravas realized that the Pandavas were still alive. They summoned them back to Hastinapur. Duryodhan, by now, had already been made crown prince. There was no chance of Yudhishthir getting his hands on the royal headgear again. So instead, Dhritarashtra, Duryodhan, and Duryodhan's uncle Shakuni gave the Pandavas a piece of land as a compromise. The land was a very dense and inhospitable forest. But through hard work and with a little bit of help from Krishna and Agni, the god of fire, Arjun cleared out the forest and transformed the land into a kingdom, complete with a spectacular palace. Neighbor's envy, owner's pride. Neighbor Duryodhan was envious, of course, and sought to take over the palace and the kingdom for himself. That plot involved a game of Ludo. It was Pandavas versus Kauravas. Who would have thought that such a harmless game would play such a major role in history? But we are getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go to the Ludo chamber in Hastinapur. Dhritarashtra was crunching his way through his fifth bag of popcorn, and anyone could have detected a father beaming with pride and joy. His son, the apple of his eye, his Duryodhan, had just demonstrated how awesome he was at Ludo. True, Duryodhan hadn't even touched the dice. It was Shakuni doing all the playing. But Dhritarashtra was still immensely proud of Duryodhan. Duryodhan was the one in charge, the one to whom all the spoils went. Duryodhan, so far, had won all the wealth of the kingdom of Indraprastha. He had also won the king's horses and all the king's men. Not won over, simply won. Because Yudhishthir had been careless enough to bet everything that he could get his hands on. His gold, his silver, his mines, his farms, his kingdom, his horses, his elephants, his servants, his army, his palace, and then his own brothers. And finally, himself. Due to a series of poor judgment, coupled with his terrible Ludo skills, Yudhishthir had now become Duryodhan's servant. And then, things got a lot worse. The court that was buzzing with people's grumbling suddenly stopped dead when Yudhishthir announced that the next thing he had to offer was Queen Draupadi herself. In that silence, you could have heard a pin drop. Even Dhritarashtra stopped crunching his popcorn and gulped nervously. A buzz arose now. Cries and shouts. And some laughter. But Shakuni was quick. He wasn't going to give anyone else a chance to intervene or object. He had the go-ahead from Yudhishthir, and he immediately rolled the dice. Dhritarashtra kept his ears pricked for the result. The "How's that?" from Duryodhan told him the whole story. There were celebrations of all kinds from the Kauravas. Dushashan slid towards the Pandav fan area and tore off his t-shirt in celebration. He got a yellow card for that, but he didn't really care. Duryodhan announced proudly that they had done it. Draupadi was theirs. This is ridiculous, interjected Vidur. He was Dhritarashtra's brother and also an advisor in the court. This makes no sense. This was not a fair fight, Vidur announced. That irked Duryodhan. Arey oh, Uncle Ji, this was a completely fair game. We agreed to the rules and we won everything fair and square. So stay out of it. No, even better, stay in it if you want. Go and fetch Draupadi. That is my command. This disrespect was about to get a lot worse. Vidur somehow kept his cool and stayed on. But he did not go and fetch Draupadi. Only the king could command him. Dhritarashtra was still the king and still in charge of the court. This was Dhritarashtra's cue to intervene. But just then, he was working through a particularly large mouthful of popcorn. And time, tide, and evil intentions do not wait for a person to finish chewing. Go and fetch Draupadi, Duryodhan commanded the chamberlain. The chamberlain, an old man close to retirement age, cursed himself for not calling in sick this morning. But he couldn't disobey a direct order. So he crept like a snail, unwillingly, to Draupadi's chambers, as Kalidas might have described his actions. Kalidas, in case you don't know, was a great Indian poet, to the point that you might call Shakespeare the Kalidas of the English-speaking world. But anyway, back to Draupadi, who was curled up with the latest edition of the Royal Gossip magazine. Her maid announced the chamberlain's arrival. Just as Draupadi had reached the article promising to reveal the shocking details of Karna's birth. Draupadi reluctantly set aside this engrossing magazine and called in her visitor. The old man had made up his mind to break the news gently, but now all he could do was to stand there, shuffling his feet. By all means, Chamberlain, take your time. Hanging around waiting for you to speak is a really thrilling experience, Draupadi said dryly. The Chamberlain found speech. My lady, Yudhishthir has gambled away everything. Your ride home, your husband's, himself, and yourself. Duryodhan owns you now and commands you to go to him in the Ludo chamber. What? Draupadi was shocked. This was a new low. Was this a prank? It wasn't the 1st of April. Was this a reality show with camera crews that would leap out any moment and scream Bakra? But no. The Chamberlain looked dead serious. Draupadi had him repeat himself 3 more times before she fully understood how dire the situation was. And now, Duryodhan was ordering her to appear before him, like she was his servant. She sent the Chamberlain back with a question. I don't have time for this. What does she want to do? Play 20 questions? Duryodhan asked. No, we are playing Ludo, reminded Karna. Your Highness, it's not a question for you, the Chamberlain clarified. It's a question for Yudhishthir. Well, out with it, man. What is it? Dhritarashtra asked, impatiently. Yudhishthir, Draupadi wants to know if you lost her before or after you lost yourself. Yudhishthir had lost her freedom at the very end, after he had lost his own freedom. You listeners know it. Yudhishthir knew it. And yet, he could not respond. Was it shame? Was it embarrassment? Was he simply dizzy from the trauma of this self-inflicted catastrophe? I honestly don't know. For once, I have to say that I'm not sure. You know that I can freely travel anywhere in time and space. And yet, this is one place that I've done my very best to avoid. Duryodhan was getting frustrated with all these sidebars. Dushasan, go get Draupadi. Drag her here if you have to. Not one of the Pandavas said anything. Dhritarashtra remained silent. Ditto Bhishma, ditto Vidar, Dronacharya, and Kripacharya. Dushasan stormed into Draupadi's chamber unannounced and chased her across many rooms. Finally, he caught her. Draupadi resisted, but it wasn't very difficult for a very well-trained warrior like Dushasan to overpower a princess who had, well, lived like a princess, never needing to rely on her own abilities to defend herself. Dushasan took Duryodhan's advice quite literally. He grabbed Draupadi by her hair and dragged her to the Ludo room. And the shameful thing was that no one said a word. No one got up to help. Not the Pandavas, not the king, not any of the elders, as Draupadi was dragged into their presence by her brother-in-law. Dushasan, Duryodhan, Karna, and Shakuni, on the other hand, had the expressions of children who have just been handed unlimited VIP passes to their favorite amusement park. Let's make her sweep the floor, Karna suggested. No, we can ask her to become the servant of another maid. That'll be exponential humiliation, Shakuni offered. Duryodhan had an extreme idea. He ordered Draupadi to come and sit on his lap. Draupadi didn't move. It's right here, Duryodhan told Draupadi, pointing at his thigh. Are you expecting me to draw you a map? Draupadi was the only one who spoke up, and she addressed not this rowdy gang, but the king. This was Dhritarashtra's assembly, after all. His word was law. If it turns out that I have become a servant, I'll follow the Servant Handbook of Rules and Regulations, 18th edition. I'll do all those wild things your sons are thinking up, if I must. But king, answer me one question, just one question. Is a wife the property of her husband? If the answer is no, I was never eligible to be wagered in this Ludo championship of yours. If a wife is merely the property of her husband, Yudhishthir lost the right to own any property the moment he lost himself. So how could I have been staked at all? I'll accept your answer, whatever it is. But Dhritarashtra stayed silent. He had no answer to that. Vidar, Bhishma, Dronacharya, Kripacharya, no one else had an answer to this either. You are the wise men of this court. How can you not know the answer? She tried again, and this time directed her question to people individually. You, Bhishma, you're the eldest, the wisest. the most powerful member of this family. Are you just on the hook for protecting whoever sits on the throne? Do you have no obligation to protect anyone else in the family, including your daughter-in-law? Bhishma remained silent. And you, Vidur, you are the minister of ethics. You know every law in our land. What does your law book say about this? Still silence. And Dronacharya, is this what you taught your students at your prestigious university? Did you teach the Pandavas to gamble away all their possessions? And did you teach the Kauravas to treat women like this? She turned to face Kripacharya, which made him break into a sweat. But then she changed her mind and addressed Dhritarashtra instead. After all, Kripacharya wasn't the most important character. He hadn't done much in the last few episodes. King Dhritarashtra, you are fortunate that you're not witnessing this scene live. Can I get an answer to my question? What right did anyone have to gamble me away? Dhritarashtra finally replied, You're asking the wrong person, my dear. Ask Yudhishthir. How could he have sunk so low by gambling you away in this game of chance? Draupadi had been saving up for this. She turned to face Yudhishthir. Did you ask for my permission before staking my freedom like this? And even if you argue that a husband has the right to do that, you are not my exclusive husband. I have 4 other husbands. Did you ask Bhim, Arjun, Nakul and Sahadev if they consented to this? Yudhishthir did not have an answer. During the game, Bhim and Arjun had unsuccessfully tried to rein in Yudhishthir's reckless decisions. But now, Bhim actually tried to take matters into his own hands. By taking Yudhishthir's hands and trying to burn them, he was only stopped by his other brothers. The fighting among the Pandavas was making Shakuni happier and happier. Before today, they had always presented a united front, and that was their strength. Duryodhan was happy with this too, but he had bigger things in mind. All this fuss, he thought, was just Draupadi trying to weasel out of her new status as a servant. She was talking about protecting the family honor, but what honor did she have? A servant had no honor, according to Duryodhan. In an extreme moment of depravity, he ordered Dushasan to disrobe her. Despite Draupadi's resistance, that is what Dushasan proceeded to do. He didn't quite succeed, and the reason for that was neither a lack of education on his part, nor a clever choice of clothing by Draupadi. The only bit that helped her was divine intervention. She closed her eyes and prayed. She prayed to the one person whose presence in this court could have completely avoided all of this. Krishna. He was away in a different kingdom, but he heard her silent prayer. And before you ask, Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu, so that means he has superpowers, including teleporting a streaming garment from thousands of kilometers away. So even though Dushasan kept pulling more and more of Draupadi's sari, she never ran out of sari. Dushasan didn't give up. He kept tugging at it and pulling it, and yet Draupadi remained completely clothed. 30 minutes later, Dushasan collapsed, exhausted, beside a 20-foot tall mountain of sari. Draupadi was still completely clothed. She had had a lucky escape, but that didn't mean she wasn't deeply upset. I don't know what Yudhishthir was thinking. Maybe he saw the pile of sari, which would definitely be worth a pretty penny, and wondered if this was his way to get back into the game and win everything back. For everyone's sake, I'm glad he didn't act on such an impulse. Bhim was the only Pandav who reacted. The very thigh that Duryodhan had directed Draupadi to sit on? Bhim swore that he would rip apart that thigh and beat Duryodhan to death with it. And as for Dushasan, Bhim promised to tear the hands that had dared to clutch Draupadi's hair. And, for good measure, he was going to rip open Dushasan's chest and drink his blood. And until he did so, Bhim would not face his ancestors. That seemed to galvanize some of the others in the assembly into speaking. Maybe because they knew that Bhim was easily strong enough to do exactly what he had just promised. Vidur strongly opposed the events of this day. This was the country's darkest hour, he said. Nothing could erase this moment and their participation in this infamous episode. And what was more, his laws, his code of ethics indicated that Draupadi was right. He agreed that Yudhishthir could never have staked her at all. Draupadi glared daggers at him, wondering why he hadn't come to that conclusion sooner. Vikarna, who was one of Duryodhan's brothers, blurred party lines by speaking up against his brother. That should have made Duryodhan upset. But only 1 out of 100 brothers dissented? That wasn't a bad ratio. Vikarna went on to say how terrible the situation was. What had his brothers and his cousins sunk to? The utter amount of disrespect shown to the daughter-in-law of this dynasty was absolutely unacceptable. As if to agree with both of these opinions, there was a sudden noise as a number of jackals could be heard howling, as well as donkeys braying and vultures screeching. Any one of those sounds was an omen of destruction. And now, with all of these being heard simultaneously, it put the superstitious Dhritarashtra into panic mode. What happened today is a terrible thing, he said, and I can't change the past. Yudhishthir recklessly gambled away people as if they were mere objects in his collection. And Draupadi is the one who had to pay the price for it. Draupadi, ask me anything you want, you shall have it. Draupadi immediately asked for Yudhishthir's freedom. Seriously? Thought everyone in court. The guy with the serious gambling problem that had landed them in this mess in the first place? She was asking for his freedom? Why not Arjun or even Bhim? But it didn't matter. Dhritarashtra had given his word, so he made good on it. Dhritarashtra went ahead and overrode Duryodhan and freed Yudhishthir on the spot. But it was not enough. Ask for something more, Draupadi. That is not enough. Draupadi asked for the freedom of the other four Pandavas. Dhritarashtra freed them all. But he still wasn't satisfied. Or rather, the howling of the jackals and the screeching of the vultures hadn't fully stopped. So he wanted to do more. He announced that everything Yudhishthir had lost today would go back to him. Duryodhan was gritting his fists and clenching his teeth. Or rather, the other way around, but you know what I mean. Karna made the observation that while the Pandav brothers had been wallowing in varying states of self-pity, shame and anger, it was Draupadi who had taken the practical step of getting them out of the mess they were in. Hats off to her wisdom, he proclaimed, which only further incensed Arjun. I don't want to hear her name from your lips, Karna. Not even praise. It's no shock to anyone that you and I are headed for a showdown. And when we do, I'll teach you a lesson you'll not forget. Dhritarashtra urged Yudhishthir to take his brothers, his queen, and to go back to Indraprasth and rule everything, just as he had done before. Duryodhan did not take all of this quietly. He had won fair and square, and now he felt he was being cheated out of all of his new possessions, as he put it. He couldn't directly defy his father at that moment. After all, Dhritarashtra was still the king. And yet, all this only deepened Duryodhan's resolve. The Pandavas had to be completely humiliated and destroyed. We'll see what Duryodhan does about it, but that will be in a future episode. I don't actually know what they did with the mountain of sari in the Ludo room. One hopes that they cut it up and distributed it to the poorer members of society. Or maybe Krishna made the pile disappear magically, just as he had made it appear. After all, Krishna would not have liked leaving a mess in the great Hastinapur palace. Pretty soon, he would be involved in a bigger political mess. That was the friction between the Kauravas and the Pandavas. That's it for this time. Check out the links in the show notes and on the site sfipodcast.com for previous Mahabharata episodes. In the next episode, we'll do a Saptarishi story. This one is about the creation of the river Godavari. Some of you have rightly pointed out that we are getting pretty close to episode 300. In fact, today's episode is number 298, though it looks like 273. That's because of all the bonus episodes that I did in between. There's another milestone that's also coming up. In about a month, we'll have completed 5 years of this show. I'm truly grateful for all your love and all your support in making this podcast what it is. I'll post an update about these huge numbers, as well as a few of my thoughts on the future of this show. Watch this space for more. Thank you all for the comments on social media and on Spotify's Q&A. Now, with the latest update, I can actually reply to the questions there. So I'll reply to your comments directly. If you have any other comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com, or leave a comment on Spotify. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. You can listen to the show on all podcast apps, as well as YouTube. If you want to send me an email, it's storiesfromindiapodcast@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.